In 1998, a newlywed couple boarded a midnight ferry across Lake Michigan and were never seen again. No splash, no goodbye. Their car was still parked at the dock. 2 wedding bands left behind. For 25 years, the case stayed cold until a diver surfaced with a bridal veil tangled in a sunken wreck. And what we found beneath the lake was only the beginning. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name's Kate Delaney. I'm 47 now, but back then I was just 21, still trying to figure out where I fit in the world. I lived in Milwaukee, worked nights at a coffee house on Water Street, and rented a little upstairs apartment with chipped tile and a crooked door that never quite closed right. Life was simple then. I still believed in people. I believed that if you got good grades, showed up to work, and treated folks right, things would turn out okay. That's how we were raised. Order, routine, trust. My sister Emily was always the dreamer. She was older by 5 years, steady and graceful in a way I wasn't. She worked at a local nonprofit, wore linen in the summer, and made people feel calm just by being near them. When she got engaged to Daniel Stokes, this sweet, slightly nerdy teacher from Muskegon, it felt like everything was clicking into place. Their wedding was in early June, a warm Saturday, held under a rented tent near Lake Michigan, all soft lighting and laughter and bare feet in the grass. The reception wound down just after 10. Most folks drove home. A few of us stayed behind to help fold chairs and collect centerpieces. Emily and Daniel were taking the ferry that night, the midnight run from Milwaukee to Muskegon, just the 2 of them. They'd rented a cabin on the Michigan side for their honeymoon. Simple, private, no photographers, no fuss. I remember she hugged me before they left, her dress still damp around the hem from dancing barefoot in the grass. She smelled like roses and wind. "See you in a week," she said. And that was it. The ferry wasn't crowded that night, just a handful of late travelers and a few leftover guests. I know because I looked over the manifest later. Their silver Toyota was parked in slot 22 on the upper deck. Emily had packed her bouquet in the back seat, even though the flowers were already starting to wilt. I didn't think much of it when I didn't hear from her the next day. She said she wanted to unplug. They were off-grid, no phones, no email. But when Monday came and there was still no word, something started to itch in the back of my mind. Then came the call. From the rental company. The car was still in the ferry terminal lot, doors locked, engine cold. Their bags were inside. The shawl I'd lent her, the navy blue one from our grandmother, was folded neatly on the passenger seat. I didn't understand at first. I thought maybe they'd taken a cab, maybe they were hiking, but something didn't feel right. There was no note, no check-in, no sign they'd ever left the dock. That's when I called the police, and that's when the silence began. I didn't sleep the night we got the call about the car. I just sat at the kitchen table with the landline cord wrapped around my hand, staring at the rental receipt and trying to make sense of it. The car was still there. Slot 22. Same spot it had been logged the night of the crossing. The ferry had docked in Muskegon like always, but nobody had picked up the keys. Nobody had stepped off with luggage, and there were no reports of an incident on board. Just silence. When I finally drove over to the terminal the next morning, it was still misty out. The sun hadn't quite broken through the clouds yet. You could smell the lake before you saw it, sharp, metallic cold. I parked a few rows down and walked over on foot. The Camry looked untouched. Silver body clean, no sign of impact, no damage. Locked. A navy shawl folded neatly on the passenger seat. A small overnight bag in the back. tuxedo hanging in a garment bag. The bouquet, Emily's bouquet, wilted but still intact, just sitting there like someone had left in a hurry and fully intended to return. A local officer named Riley Voss met me at the edge of the lot. I remember he had a quiet way about him, didn't rush his questions, didn't press. He just took everything in, asked what he needed, and made notes in a small spiral pad. Later, I'd learn he was with the cold case unit. Said he'd worked this file off and on for over a decade. No one had touched it seriously in years, not since the original investigators aged out and the trail froze over. But now, in 2024, something had pulled it back into view. Voss opened his folder and showed me a photo. A scrap of lace soaked and water-darkened, sealed in an evidence bag. A diver had found it tangled on a submerged tugboat just off the North Shore about 4 miles from the ferry route. Bridal fabric. Stitching almost identical to what Emily wore. I didn't even have to touch it. I recognized it through the plastic. My throat closed. Voss said the diver had caught it on a winch cable while surfacing. The wreck it had snagged on was old, maybe from the 1940s, but what they found beneath it was newer. He flipped to a sonar still on his tablet. Grainy image, dark and distorted, but there was something lying just below the tug. Angular, compact, too clean to be debris. A car. He said visibility was poor, but the shape didn't belong there. It had either drifted with the current or someone had meant for it to be dropped where no one would ever look. And for 25 years, no one had. Voss didn't wait. He coordinated a follow-up dive early the next morning. Conditions were steady. Lake calm. Wind low. I wasn't there when they found her, but I heard it in his voice when he called me later that day. Elijah the diver had gone down again, this time with a tighter search grid. He descended past the tugboat, past the rusted railings and algae blooms, and reached the object on the lakebed. It was a car. Front end crushed, roof partially caved. Silt blanketed everything. On the passenger side, under a bent piece of frame, he found more lace, delicate torn, still clinging. And inside, just visible behind a clouded window, was bone. A single femur white against the dark. Female frame, submerged for decades. It was her. Emily had been down there the entire time, locked in silence. No one had seen it happen. No crew reports, no disturbance, no mayday call. The only evidence left behind had been a folded shawl and a rental receipt. The car had told the rest of the story, only no one had known where to look. But Daniel. There was no sign of Daniel. No body. No trace. Just her. That night, Voss went back through the original manifest. 52 passengers had been listed on the June 6th midnight crossing. 50 were matched to names. 2 weren't. 2 anonymous boardings paid in cash at the terminal just minutes before departure. Back then, no ID was required. You could buy a ticket with paper money and walk on without question. And someone had. Someone had stepped aboard that ferry with no name and no face and had never been logged again. We didn't know who they were, not yet, but they'd been there. That's when I brought Voss the envelope I'd found in my father's basement. He had passed a few months earlier, and I was sorting through boxes when I came across it. A roll of 35mm film, still undeveloped. Wrapped in the original wedding program. I almost threw it away, but something about it felt unfinished. I handed it over to Voss, told him I wasn't sure what was on it. The camera had gone missing that night. We assumed it had gotten lost in the shuffle. Maybe someone had taken it home by accident. Maybe it had fallen off the ferry. Turns out my dad had it the whole time, and maybe he didn't want to see what was on it. They developed the photos that afternoon. Most were harmless dancing toasts, the reception under string lights. But toward the end of the roll, the tone changed. A few shots showed the dock, the crowd, people boarding. Then one image taken from across the ferry lot caught something none of us expected. A man, standing at the edge of the boarding line, leather coat, hands in pockets, eyes obscured by shadow, watching, not smiling, not interacting, just watching. I stared at the printout for a long time. I didn't recognize him. He wasn't family, wasn't a friend. I checked the guest list. His name wasn't there. We pulled up a second set of photos from another wedding, Callie Andrews, a friend of Emily's from college, held just a few weeks before ours, also near the lake. And in the background of one of her photos there, he was again, same coat, same posture, standing near the pier just outside the frame. Watching. Whoever he was, he hadn't stumbled across us by chance. He'd been following something. Or someone, and my sister had seen him. We found proof of that too, not in a photograph, but on the back of a cocktail napkin Emily had tucked into a memory box. Written in her handwriting, rushed and uneven. I saw him again. The man from Callie's wedding. He was near the ferry ramp, dated June 5th, the night before she vanished. She saw him. She knew. And no one had listened. Voss didn't say much when I handed it to him, just underlined the note and added it to the file. We had a face now, or at least a presence, a shape, a shadow. He wasn't on the guest list, he wasn't on the manifest, but he'd been there, and that meant someone else had too, someone who shouldn't have been anywhere near that boat. We didn't know what it meant yet. Not fully, but something was rising to the surface piece by piece, and it was starting to take shape. I didn't expect anyone to believe me. Not after all this time. People had moved on. The few friends who still remembered Emily did so in that soft, distanced way people do when they've filed someone under gone too soon. Even when I showed them the photo, the man at the ferry ramp, their eyes flicked toward the edges like maybe it was just a stranger. Or maybe I was reading too much into it. You start to feel that doubt settle on you like dust. Quiet, accusing, the kind of silence that makes you question your own certainty. But Voss didn't flinch. He kept digging, quietly, methodically. He pulled the ferry logs from that summer and started combing through other missing person reports from the area. Couples who never checked into lakeside cabins, cars that were never picked up, honeymooners who disappeared into the noise. And one night, he called me around 9, said he'd found something, not a match, not exactly, but a pattern. In 1994, a couple named George and Natalie James vanished after boarding the same midnight ferry. Same route, same lack of footage, same story. They parked their car, were seen boarding together, and then were simply never seen again. Their vehicle had never been found. No signs of foul play. Just 2 more names on the list of unexplained disappearances tied to that crossing. I asked Voss if there had ever been any theory. He said at the time the assumption was either a lover's pact or a tragic accident. Maybe they jumped. Maybe they fell. Maybe they never boarded at all. But when he pulled the original notes there, it was again one unnamed ticket. Bought in cash. Boarded alone. No ID. Nothing recorded. Just a shadow on the manifest. like someone knew how to slip in without being seen. That made 3. Ours, the Jameses, and a third case, one that hadn't even been logged as part of the ferry record. A couple on a private lake cruise in 2002, their boat was recovered. They weren't. Voss ordered the DNA from the lace fragment retested against stored samples from each of those years. When the report came back, the results were clear. The unknown male profile matched all 3. Same genetic material, same presence, same ghost. But no name, no identity, no matches in any law enforcement database. Whoever this man was, he didn't exist on paper. And that meant for a long time no one had been looking for him. Voss flagged the case internally, but he told me not to expect much. Cold cases had their own gravity. Too many missing people. Too few answers. And a system that often leaned toward the simplest version of events. People don't vanish, they leave. Or they die quietly, far from the eyes of anyone who might care. But we knew better now. I could feel it every time I looked at that napkin. Emily's handwriting rushed and scared. She saw him, and she knew something wasn't right. Then came the second photo. This one wasn't from us. It came from a woman named Callie Andrews, the college friend whose wedding Emily had attended just a month before her own. Callie and I had stayed loosely in touch, and when I asked if she still had her wedding album, she didn't hesitate. She scanned a handful of photos and sent them that same night. And there he was again. In the background, barely in focus. Same coat, same posture, standing near the water's edge. Watching, not smiling, just there, present, waiting. I sent it to Voss, and he stared at it for a long time without speaking. Then he brought out the printout of our boarding photo and laid them side by side. The angle was different, the lighting softer, but it was unmistakably the same man, and no one remembered inviting him. No one had logged him on the guest list. His name didn't appear in any record of either wedding. 2 events, same lake, same ferry, same figure on the edge of the frame. That's when Voss started pulling everything, every photo, every name, every unsolved case connected to the Manitou line. He didn't speak much during those days. Just scribbled notes, red-penned boarding logs, and circled ticket numbers without names. One afternoon, he pointed to a copy of the 1998 manifest. Emily and Daniel checked in early. Their car was recorded. Their IDs matched. But someone else came on just before departure. 2 cash tickets, bought at 11:39 p.m. No names, no IDs, just booth initials. I asked if we'd ever be able to track them. He shook his head. The employee retired. The cameras didn't save footage past 2001. These passengers, whoever they were, walked through a blind spot. That night, I sat on my back porch with the photos spread out on the table. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. Just something. Anything. A clue we'd missed. A connection we hadn't made. And then I noticed something strange in one of the ferry deck photos. It wasn't the man in the coat this time. It was the way Emily was holding her hand, not resting on the railing. It was being held. Firmly. You could see the tension in her arm, her shoulders tight. The man beside her only half in frame, cropped out at the shoulder, but the grip was unmistakable. Fingers wrapped around her wrist. Not tender, not playful. Intentional. I brought it to Voss the next morning. He studied it, jaw clenched. She didn't fall. he said quietly. She didn't run. He tapped the corner of the print. Someone approached her. Someone followed her out there. I asked the question we'd both been avoiding. Where's Daniel in all this? Voss looked down. That's the next piece, he said. And I could see it in his face. Whatever happened on that ferry wasn't just one act. It wasn't isolated. There were layers to it, a pattern forming, and we were only starting to see the edges. Voss didn't say much over the next few days. He worked late, stayed in the records room well after the building emptied out. I knew because I started calling at odd hours, not expecting answers, just needing to know someone was still digging. Most nights he'd pick up on the second ring, his voice low-tired. He wasn't sleeping much either. You could hear it. One night he told me he'd started charting it all out on a map, 4 disappearances across 13 years, all linked to the same midnight ferry route. Each one involved a couple. Each one ended with silence. That wasn't something you could explain away with current or chance. It wasn't an accident. It was rhythm. And whoever had been riding that ferry, they knew exactly how to slip between the lines. What made it worse, what made it stick in your throat, was that the world didn't seem to care. The story had gotten a few headlines back in '98. Young couple vanishes on wedding night. But once the police came up short, interest moved on. People assumed what they always assume, that someone made a mistake or they changed their minds and ran. You'd be amazed how fast the narrative shifts when there's no blood, no body, no villain you can point to. And so time did what it always does. It washed everything out. But now we had fragments, a photograph, a scrap of lace, a pattern in a manifest that nobody had bothered to connect. And still the system wasn't designed to act on hunches. Voss had to fight to keep the investigation open. Too many years, too many missing records, and too few people willing to admit they'd overlooked something real. So he kept going the only way he could, quietly piece by piece adding to the board. I stopped by his office once during that stretch just to drop off another box I'd found in storage. Emily had kept everything. Programs, thank you cards, ribbons, even drink napkins. We were going through one of them when he noticed the handwriting on the back, small faded, pressed into the paper, hard enough that the indent still showed through. I saw him again. The man from Callie's wedding. He was near the ferry ramp. The date scrawled next to it was June 5th, the night before she disappeared. Voss didn't say anything at first. He just turned the napkin over in his hand a few times, then slid it into an evidence sleeve. I remember he looked at me and said very quietly, "This wasn't random." After that, something shifted. He started pulling crew logs. Not just for the night Emily vanished, but for every midnight crossing tied to a disappearance. Most were too old to yield anything usable: paperwork, misplaced names, misspelled people retired or relocated. But one stuck. A shift report from June of '98. A crewman had mentioned hearing something strange near the back cargo ramp, a scraping noise like metal on metal followed by a splash. He'd radioed it in, was told it was probably a mooring pin or a loose bracket, nothing to worry about. But he filed it anyway, and 2 days later, he was reassigned. Voss tracked him down in a trailer park about 40 minutes outside Manistee. His name was R.J. Parker. He was in his late 60s now, living alone, most of his furniture covered in old blankets and plastic bins. Said he didn't talk about the lake anymore, not since they pushed him out. But when Voss mentioned the Manitou, RJ just nodded once and said I knew somebody'd come around again. They sat in a diner off Route 31, one of those places where the coffee's always burnt and the blinds never sit quite straight. RJ said he remembered that night clear as day. Wasn't anything loud, he told Voss. It was the quiet that caught me. Felt off, like the wind stopped moving. He remembered seeing a man alone on the starboard side. Not a guest. Not crew. Just there. Lean, pale, wearing a dark coat. Said he walked like someone trying not to make noise. He floated, RJ said. That was the word he used. Everyone else had someone with him. But this guy? He watched. When he reported it, he said nobody took him seriously. His supervisor chalked it up to nerves, said he'd been working too many overnight shifts. 3 weeks later, he was out. They said budget cuts, he told Voss. But I knew what it was. I saw something I wasn't supposed to. When Voss got back to the station, he added RJ's name to the board. Another thread. Another piece of a shape that was starting to form, not clearly, not yet, but enough to know it had structure. We didn't have answers, but we had a direction. That night, I sat with the autopsy report in my lap. They'd confirmed it was Emily. The body recovered from the lake was hers. She'd been there the whole time, locked inside a car resting against the side of a tugboat that hadn't been touched in over half a century. The cold had preserved her more than anyone expected. No obvious trauma. No defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, and no trace of Daniel. It was like they'd been separated or like he'd never made it that far. And that's what stayed with me. If they were together on the ferry and every witness said they were, then what happened after she walked out onto that deck? Where did he go? And why was only one of them meant to be found? Voss kept asking the same questions. Some nights he'd call just to run a theory by me. Other nights he didn't say much at all. Just long stretches of silence interrupted by small facts. He started watching the lake in a different way, not as something tragic, but as something deliberate, chosen. He marked the GPS coordinates of every recovery, cross-referenced weather patterns, looked at where the currents would have carried a vehicle, and all of it pointed to one thing: none of these disappearances were accidents. The cars didn't drift. They were placed. And if Emily's was meant to be found, then someone had made a mistake, or someone had changed the rules. We didn't know which yet, but it meant something. And whatever it was getting closer. The next break didn't come from sonar or forensics. It came from the water. A few weeks after Emily was recovered, the lake turned calm again, still and glassy, like it had exhaled something it didn't want to hold anymore. Voss sent the dive team back out this time with a tighter search grid just southeast of the tugboat wreck. The plan was simple: expand the radius and check every depression in the silt shelf, no matter how minor. If Daniel had been there too in a second vehicle or dragged off course by current, this was their best chance. The water was cold that morning. A gray light settled over the lake, diffused by low clouds and the kind of silence that made engines sound louder than they were. Elijah Mears adjusted his gear on the deck, his fingers steady, his breath visible. He didn't say much before slipping below the surface, just nodded once at Voss and disappeared under the waves. It took 45 minutes. The sonar picked it up first, a low, slanted shape lodged halfway into a ledge of limestone, maybe 30 feet off the original recovery site. Smaller than the first car, more intact. It hadn't rusted through yet, which told them the seal might have held longer. Elijah got eyes on it just after 10. He radioed up what he saw: a compact sedan, front half buried, glass-clouded silt, heavy around the wheel wells. The interior wasn't empty. A heel floated near the back seat. Thin fabric pressed against the driver's window curled like petals. A wedding invitation, waterlogged but legible, rested beneath the dashboard. Voss got there within the hour. By then, the recovery team had sealed everything in waterproof containers. They laid the items out beneath a canopy on the lead boat. The heel, the invitation, a small black box. Inside the box were 2 Polaroids, both faded but still sharp enough to make out the faces. One showed Daniel raising a glass half turned toward the camera, his arm around Emily's waist. The other was darker, taken later, maybe on the ferry, but it was them. Together. Still whole. Still moving through the night like they believed they'd reach the other side. The box also contained a key. Rusted, but intact. It matched the ignition of the second car. There were no remains inside. No bones. No clothing. Just the echo of someone who had once been there. Voss stood there longer than usual that day, looking out across the lake, trying to decide if this was closure or misdirection. The items told a story, but not all of it. Something was missing. Later that afternoon, I met him at the station. He'd laid the invitation out on the table, flattened beneath a glass weight. The gold lettering had dulled, but the names were still visible. Emily and Daniel. June 6, 1998. I told him she must have kept an extra one. Emily saved everything, small things, things that held meaning only she could explain. Voss nodded slowly, then said something I hadn't considered. We believe she was placed in the first car after death. This second vehicle, there's no trace of her inside, just fragments. A shoe, the key, some fabric. Whoever put her in the first car didn't drive it from here. They brought her from somewhere else. I asked him if that meant Daniel might still be alive. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, whoever moved her wanted her found. But not him, which means one of them might have seen something. I remember the way that sentence settled between us. Heavy, still, like he didn't want to finish the thought. So I did. And one of them had to be silenced. It wasn't the first time we'd circled that idea. But now we were starting to see how it might have played out. 2 cars, one with a body, one with a memory of where they began. Voss sent both vehicles for deeper processing. They stripped every fiber, pulled every trace of biological material they could find. What came back 2 days later was more than we expected. They found skin cells on the interior roof lining of the second car. Not Daniel's, not Emily's, male, unidentified, but it matched the same partial profile pulled from the lace fragment, the one snagged on the wreck. The same DNA showed up in the James case from '94, and again in the couple from the private lake cruise in 2002. Same man, same genetic markers, same disappearance pattern. Voss pinned the results beside the map. 4 disappearances. 3 bodies confirmed. 1 man. No name. No match in any national database. No prints. No license. No military service. Nothing. Just a string of silent exits that stretched over a decade. That night he stayed late, going over every possible link. Ferry crew rosters, ticket sales, passenger logs. Then something new came across his desk, a tip from a woman in Green Bay. She didn't leave her name, but she said she'd been engaged once to someone who vanished on a ferry run in 1994, and that he came back. 6 years later. Voss called her the next morning. Her name was Allison Groves. They arranged to meet that same week. She lived in a small duplex on the edge of town, window shades drawn, front walk swept clean. I offered to go with him, but he said no. Some things he told me are better heard one-on-one. When he returned, he looked different. Not shaken, just quieter. Said her fiancé Jacob Halpern had boarded the midnight ferry back in '94. Never came home. No body was found. No evidence he'd fallen or jumped. They assumed he drowned until the summer of 2000 when he showed up on her porch. Gaunt, silent, refused to speak for 4 days. When he finally did, it wasn't much. He said someone else had been on that boat, a man in a coat talking to another couple near the rear deck. Then they were gone. Just like that. Jacob remembered being taken. He remembered the smell of mold metal damp wood. Underground. He didn't think he'd been the target. Said he wasn't supposed to be there. That he'd escaped by mistake. He left a note the night he died. Short. Disjointed. Said he wasn't free. Said he still saw the man's face in every shadow. Voss added his name to the board. Not as a victim, but as a survivor. And suddenly the rules changed. Not everyone had been killed. One had gotten out. One had lived long enough to write it down. It meant there was more than one location, more than just water, more than just the ferry. It meant someone had taken Jacob Halpern off that boat, held him somewhere, and let him go. And now someone else had taken Emily and Daniel. One was gone. One was missing. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because if Jacob was right, if there was a place beneath all of this, then the lake wasn't the end. It was just the cover. And somewhere out there, the rest of the truth was still waiting. The lead came from a utility record. A cabin in Leelanau County, Michigan, set back from the road, no listing on any rental site, no tax history since the early 90s. And yet the water bills had stayed consistent. Small amounts. Just enough to suggest someone was coming and going. A freezer drawing power. A faucet run occasionally. Nothing large enough to raise flags, but steady. Purposeful. Voss found it buried in a set of land use reports filed by the state after a shoreline inspection. The cabin didn't belong to any of the families involved. No known connection to the ferry. No ownership trail that led anywhere useful. But the records went back almost 30 years, and that was enough. He and a state trooper drove up in the early morning hours, parked a quarter-mile out, and walked the rest of the way in on foot. The tree line was thick, damp, the kind of quiet that soaks into your coat before you notice it. No smoke, no tire tracks, no sound of movement. But when they reached the clearing, the front door wasn't locked. Inside the place was almost bare. A cot in the corner. Folded linens. A crate of canned food that had expired sometime around 2006. But the walls were covered in photographs. Hundreds of them. Some pinned in rows. Some tacked over others like layers of wallpaper. Wedding photos. Candid shots. Ferry decks, couples posed against railings. You could tell some had been taken by professionals, backlit, smiling, composed. Others were blurred, tilted, taken at distance. In almost every one there was a man, sometimes just a silhouette, sometimes clearer, always lingering at the edge of the frame. He wasn't part of the group. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was watching, just watching. They found him behind the cabin, sitting in a lawn chair like he'd been expecting them, face tilted toward the trees, eyes closed, hands folded in his lap. When they asked his name, he didn't answer, just said, "Doesn't matter." Voss showed him the photo of Emily on the ferry deck, the last one, the one where her wrist was being held. The man opened his eyes and looked at it for a long time. Pale blue, almost colorless. "I don't deny it," he said. "But I didn't kill him." "Daniel Stokes," Voss asked. The man nodded. "He's dead," he said quietly, "but not by my hand." It was the first time anyone had said it out loud, that he was gone, not missing, not escaped, gone. When they brought him in, he didn't resist, didn't ask for a lawyer. He sat through processing without protest, gave no name, no address, no history. He never raised his voice, just watched, like he always had. Voss questioned him for hours. He never admitted to violence, never described what happened on the ferry, but he said one thing more than once. "You think I was the only one?" And when Voss asked who else had been there, the man just turned his head toward the wall and smiled, thin and quiet. "People like me don't act alone," he said. "We watch, we choose, and sometimes we open a door. Some of them walk through, some don't. But once they're on the water, they're already in the current." It wasn't a confession, not legally. There was no murder weapon, no footage, nothing that could hold in court. But they had enough to keep him. Possession of stolen property, tampering with human remains, evidence concealment. Still, the questions lingered. If he hadn't killed Daniel, who had? And where had the body gone that night? Voss sat in the evidence room with every photo laid out in sequence. Each ferry shot, each blurred background figure. Then one caught his eye. A reflection in a window, not the main subject, but someone behind them. A second man, larger, broader shoulders, standing near the photographer, holding something small, a cigarette lighter. That detail struck him. Months earlier, when they had recovered Emily's remains, a lighter had been found near her hand, not Daniel's. His father confirmed it, said Daniel didn't smoke, but someone, a guest from the wedding, had given it to Emily as a joke. Some guy from Daniel's side she barely knew. The name hadn't stuck with him. Just remembered someone saying, "That's Otis, best man's cousin." Voss went back to the guest list, scanned every line, and there, scribbled in at the bottom in different handwriting, was a late edition Otis Weller. No address, no contact info, just the name, written quickly. No one remembered talking to him. No photos had captured his face clearly. But he was there, standing beside Daniel in one of the ferry boarding shots, holding champagne, grinning. 2 days after the wedding, he vanished. No forwarding address, no employer on file, no apartment linked to his name. Just gone. It was like the ground opened and swallowed him whole, except it hadn't. Someone had helped him disappear, or maybe he'd never planned to stay. The records team ran every alias they could think of. Old DMV applications, parking tickets, out-of-state hunting licenses. Finally, a match pinged on a cabin rental in the Upper Peninsula booked under a shell name tied to a P.O. box in Grand Rapids. The same name had shown up once before. A flagged vehicle had been spotted near a hiking trail 2 counties west, reported by a backpacker who noticed a chemical smell near a tree line. Local officers had marked it down, but hadn't searched the property. When Voss and I pulled up, the scene was already taped off. The coroner's van was waiting at the edge of the woods. The cabin sat quiet, smaller than the last one, darker windows covered in plywood. The air was damp. You could smell it before the door opened. Not just mildew, something else. Iron, decay, a heaviness that settled in your throat and stayed there. The main room was stripped bare. Wooden crates stacked in the corners, mold creeping up the baseboards. But in the far end, near what looked like a pantry, we found it a trap door, hand-cut, reinforced with scrap metal, bolted from above. When they pried it open, the smell hit first. But what came next was silence. Dirt floor, wood walls, groundwater pooled near the base. And in the center, laid out beneath a pile of ferry uniforms, was a body. Male. Bones still articulated, jaw broken, rib cage collapsed inward. No sign of restraint, just bruising heavy, uneven, like he'd been thrown or pushed. The coroner confirmed what we already knew. It was Daniel. His wedding band was still on, one shoe missing, mud packed into the treads of the other. Shirt fibers matched the hem of Emily's dress. Blood type confirmed. We stood beside the body bag in the morgue for a long time. No one said anything. There wasn't anything left to say. He hadn't run. He hadn't abandoned her. He'd fought, and someone made sure he'd never be found. But now he was. And the story finally had another voice. Only this time it wasn't a whisper from the water. It was what lay beneath it. And it wasn't done speaking. The service was held a week later. Small. Private. Just family, a few friends, and a bench. The county let us install it near the lake, not far from the old ferry terminal where it all began. The plaque bore both their names, Emily and Daniel Stokes, gone beneath the waves, never forgotten. I spoke that morning. I didn't want to, but I did. I said what needed to be said, that they boarded that ferry with love in their hearts, that they were met with silence, and that silence didn't get the last word. Not this time. Afterward, people lingered. Some placed flowers. Some sat with their backs to the water. But I stayed standing, watching the ferry pull out again for its evening run. Same crossing, same route. But everything was different now. Voss stood a few feet back, hands in his coat pockets, staring at the horizon like it was holding something just out of reach. When the crowd had thinned, I asked him quietly, "Do you think Otis acted alone?" He didn't answer right away, just glanced down at the photos he'd been holding. The lighter, the guest list, the list of anonymous ticket sales. Then he said, "No. I don't think he ever planned this by himself. I think he was brought into it." That was the word that stuck with me. Brought. Not recruited. Not tricked. Brought. Like someone opened a door and he stepped through. In the following days, Voss went through everything again. Photos from the cabin, statements from the man in the leather coat. Still no name. Still no real confession. But that quiet voice on tape repeating the same phrases, "We don't act alone. Some walk through. Once you're on the water, you're already in the current." Most of it sounded like riddles, but there was a structure beneath it, a rhythm. Voss believed he'd been watching for years, that he didn't do the taking, he watched the ones who did, maybe even selected the couples. He was always there, always near, but he didn't get his hands dirty. Otis did, and maybe others. We knew Otis had been at the wedding, that he boarded the ferry with Daniel and Emily, but what we didn't know was how far back his involvement went, whether he'd done it before, whether there had been others like him. Voss spent days reviewing surveillance from nearby towns, backtracking the last few known addresses tied to Otis Weller. Then, buried in a DMV audit from '99, he found a traffic stop that had never been processed properly. Different name, same face. Otis. Caught near Manistee driving a vehicle registered to someone else, a man who'd gone missing with his fiancée 2 years earlier. Another lake incident. Another silent disappearance. That was the first real thread that tied Otis to a second event. And it meant this wasn't just about Emily and Daniel. It had happened before. Maybe more than once. Voss started looking for cabins, remote properties, unregistered plots tucked against water or state forest. He worked with a GIS specialist who layered utility records over ferry traffic data going back 30 years. It didn't yield much, but one point lit up a power meter linked to an unclaimed lot in the northern part of the Upper Peninsula, the same area Otis's last alias had been traced to. When officers arrived, the door was unlocked. No one inside. But in the corner of the main room, beneath 2 rotting blankets and a stack of wooden crates, they found it a crude trapdoor, bolted from the inside. They opened it carefully. No sudden smell, no obvious signs of a recent occupant. But the room was real. Underground. Wood walls reinforced with rusted nails. A single chair, a drain cut into the dirt floor. Voss didn't say much about it after, just handed off the photos to evidence and stood there. Quiet. Still. Like he was listening for something. The room had been empty, but not undisturbed. And in one corner, half buried in soil, they found another camera, sealed in an old waterproof case. Same model as the one from Emily's wedding. No label, no identifying marks. But the film inside was intact. The lab processed it 2 days later. 3 photos, all blurred, all underwater. But the last one showed the ferry deck barely visible tilted. A wedding cake, 2 glasses, a shadow near the railing. Not Otis. Not the man in the coat. Someone else. Broader frame. Face unseen. Just enough to know the story wasn't finished. When Voss showed it to me, I didn't speak. I didn't ask who. We both knew there'd never be one answer. Not with people like this. Not with networks that didn't need names. Just places. Patterns. A rhythm so quiet it passed for coincidence. But I remember standing outside the lab that night, wind off the lake rising just enough to stir the trees. The ferry horn in the distance low and steady. And that feeling I hadn't been able to name before, like someone was still out there. Watching the dock, counting the passengers, waiting for the next midnight run. The arrest came without warning. Early morning, fog still low on the water. I got the call from Voss just as the coffee finished brewing. He didn't give me a chance to ask questions, just said, "We got movement," and hung up. By the time I reached the station, a van from the task force had already pulled in. Inside was the man from the photos, the one from the wedding guest list, the ferry deck, the shadow in the blurred camera frame. Not Otis, not the man in the coat. This one was new. Or maybe not new at all, just never seen clearly until now. His name was Anthony Carl Dempsey, 52 years old, no prior record, no listed address, registered under a contractor's license that hadn't been renewed since 2013. They picked him up less than 5 miles from the original ferry dock in a house registered to a shell company that hadn't paid taxes in over a decade. There was no struggle, no statement, just a glance toward the shoreline before they put him in the car. Inside the home, they found what they needed, not much, but enough. A folder tucked behind a loose panel under the stairs. Dozens of photos, Emily and Daniel among them. Receipts for ferry tickets going back years, each one bought in cash under different names. Maps with crossings circled in red. But it was what they found in the freezer that quieted the room. A small box, carefully wrapped. Inside was a gold wedding band. Daniel's initials still visible. Next to it, a woman's earring, blue stone silver setting. Emily never wore it to the wedding, but I'd seen it in photos from the rehearsal dinner. We never found the matching one, until now. That was enough for the warrant. The man didn't speak for 2 full days. Then, after sunset on the 3rd night, he asked to see Voss. No lawyer, no negotiation, just asked him to bring the folder. I sat outside the room while they talked. 38 minutes, no raised voices, no reaction, just one long, steady conversation. When Voss came out, he looked like he hadn't blinked the whole time. He said the man hadn't admitted to killing anyone. Not directly, but he described how it worked. The system, the pattern. The way people like him didn't hunt in cities or chase victims down highways. They waited, chose couples, ones no one would question if they vanished, elopements, private weddings, isolated venues, ferry crossings, always water, always movement, no fixed point of departure, no consistent return. They didn't need to abduct. They needed the couple to come willingly. Once they were out in the open, it only took a moment. A nudge, a fall, a push over the side. No splash if timed right, just silence. The deck goes quiet. The guests turn their backs. The water folds over and takes everything, and the current keeps moving. When Voss asked who else was involved, the man gave only one name, not a full name, just Gray. Said Gray had been the one to invite Otis, that he was the one who chose which couples were open. Voss asked what that meant. The man said it simply. It means they don't have an anchor. They drift. They're already halfway gone. We never found anyone named Gray. No record. No match, no prints. But in the corner of one photo taken during a sunset cruise the year before, there was a hand on the railing. Large, weathered, scar on the knuckle. The man from the interrogation pointed at it when shown the image. "That's him," he said. "That's Gray." The photo was taken by a tourist from Indiana. She didn't remember anything strange. Said the couple in the photo looked happy. Normal. Just another pair watching the sun go down over the water. But we knew better. That night, Voss sent a memo to every precinct in the county. A list of unsolved disappearances tied to ferry crossings. A request for open logs from smaller ports. A call to investigate long-abandoned cabins, guest lists, unofficial boat charters. It wasn't a press release. No media, no announcement. Just a quiet signal between departments the water isn't as empty as it seems. The man Dempsey was held without bail. Still no full confession. Still no confirmed link to Otis beyond the folder. But the pattern was clear. The method. The ritual. It didn't take violence, just patience. and a system built on what people didn't see. I drove home that night along the shoreline. The water was flat, quiet, ferry lights in the distance barely moving. And I realized something I hadn't before: not all predators chase. Some just wait where the current is strongest. And by the time you realize how far you've drifted, the shore's already gone. Sometimes late at night I still hear the ferry, that low, distant horn rolling across the water like it's calling someone home. Even now, even after everything we uncovered, part of me listens for it. I live farther inland now, in a smaller town away from the lake, but sound travels differently in the dark. It bends around memory, brings things back you thought were settled. Voss retired not long after the arrest. He never made a speech, just cleared out his desk, left a handwritten file on my porch, and drove west. I read through it once slowly. No new names, no new answers, just a note at the end in his handwriting. Some truths don't need solving, they need remembering. I think about that a lot. How we're trained to chase closure like it's something you can file away and move past. But with this, with Emily and Daniel, there was no real ending, just pieces that stopped moving. Their families held a second service a year later, smaller than the first. No press, no detectives, just those who knew them. Those who hadn't stopped asking what really happened. I spoke again this time by choice. Not to retell the story, just to say their names out loud in a place where silence had once swallowed everything. I remember a little boy, maybe 7 or 8, standing near the railing. He looked up and asked his mother if the water ever gives things back. She didn't answer, just knelt and hugged him close. We never found Gray. The name didn't show up in any official record, and the photo wasn't enough to issue a warrant. But we know he was real. Voss believed there were others like him, quiet operators who didn't need to use force, only familiarity. Who waited at the edges, learning patterns, disguising harm as invitation. And once the couple said yes to the trip, once they boarded with joy and trust in their hearts, the trap was already shut. I still talk to Emily's sister sometimes. We send cards, exchange quiet updates. She told me once that she doesn't dream of the wedding anymore, just of the rehearsal the night before when they were all laughing under the string lights barefoot on the dock. That's the image she holds. That's the one she's keeping. As for me, I haven't set foot on a ferry since. I still drive near the water, still glance out when the fog rolls in. But I stay on land. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of respect. I don't know anymore. What I do know is this evil doesn't always arrive in shadows. Sometimes it comes wrapped in celebration. Sometimes it boards alongside you wearing a name tag, smiling like a guest. That's what stayed with me. The way it all looked so normal. Until it wasn't. Thank you for listening. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it so no name, no truth gets left beneath the surface.